Welcome to Human Powered, the podcast about creating a high-performing agency or consultancy business. I'm Trenton Moss, and today I have James Leavesley, CEO of Torchbox, the digital agency for innovative non-profits. James, hello.
Hey, Trenton. Thanks for inviting me. Good to be here.
Thank you so much for joining. James, you've been running the business for the past 6 years and you lead a team of 110 people. Tell me, how do you define high performing in the context of the business and the most high performing people?
Yeah, I think there's probably three things that we talk about in terms of high performance at Torchbox. The first one really is about, I think we look for people that really genuinely care about working for Torchbox. And that's not really just about Torchbox and thinking about their outputs, but it's really thinking about the outcomes that they're looking for. We work in a very specific sector in non-profit, so that's charity and public sector. And we want people to really be motivated by those sectors and really get enthused about coming up with solutions. And that could be things like improving a donation funnel for Oxfam. It could be improving a digital service for a public sector organization. It's really important they really understand that and get behind trying to improve people's lives. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing, we often work across a bit of a system. So we're improving or we're inputting to their digital transformation or their digital marketing focus. And so because it's a system, we don't want solo stars. We're looking for team players that can really help across that whole piece and bring everyone else along. Now, I think particularly with the world and how it's changing, there's lots of different levels of understanding of things like how AI works and things like that. So we really need people that are those team players and that can bring people along in the right way. High performers that just do a thing on their own, that's great, but really that doesn't really add to our system. So that's not the type of person that we want. And then the third thing, I think one of the things that's probably changed in my career is that we value different strengths for the different contexts that people sit in. I think gone are the days where we're looking for the person that shouts the loudest. And that often happened. That was the case that people thought of those people as the people that were the high performers. I'm not saying that we don't want people that shout the loudest, but we also want people with all different backgrounds. We need analytical minds. We need people with commercial knowledge. So I think it depends on where they sit within the business in terms of that context and making sure that they can add that in the right way.
You talked there about wanting team players, not just solo stars. How do you engender that culture of team and people not just thinking about themselves, but about the collective good?
Yeah, I think a lot of this comes down to culture. And I think you actually need process around enabling culture and embedding culture. And obviously, value statements are important, but you actually need to have a process of getting those value statements and thinking about how that will work within the business. So the first thing I would say is those processes need to be obvious to everyone that works there. So we've got things like lead the change with one of our values and explore the unknown. So actually having people understanding how they might interact with innovation. So we have an innovation board where they can submit ideas. We also have what we call the vital few, which is a way of focusing on a few strategic priorities. And again, speaking about those and having people being able to interrogate those and add to those, I think is really important to enable that culture. It can't just be a value statement. It needs to be how we processify that across the business. I think the other thing to say is a lot of it's around how we talk to our people. So it's easy to try and think about how we protect people. So not giving them the full story. And actually what people really value is understanding the business in a lot more detail. And I think particularly because since we became an employer and trust back in 2019, that's really been a part of the journey for us, is about sort of throttling back from protection and letting people understand what is happening in the business and how they can add value to that. But I would say that what's important is that with honesty comes great responsibility. So it's about transparency with context. So if you just tell people what's happening, that's not necessarily enough. You need to really give them that sort of clarity and context around that, because if you just tell them something's changing, unless they understand why it's changing, then that can cause problems. And yeah, so I think that's a really important part of it. So I think, to give you an example of transparency with context, for instance, when we talk about how pipeline's happening over the next 3 to 6 months, in the old days, we might have shied away from having a transparent conversation about how that might happen. We've then switched to making sure that people understand it, but giving them context around that transparency and how risky we feel like that is or not, I think is really important. And I use a thing called the SCARF model, which is a thing that was set up by David Rocks to really try and make me think about exactly how we make sure that we give context around those sort of messages.
Tell me what that was like for you making that change. You throttled back from protection into transparency.
I think it's actually one of the hardest things in my career to deal with because it's almost human nature, isn't it, to try and protect people from what you perceive might be a risk to them. But what you actually do is leave a blank space for them, their minds to scurry away and think about all the potential risks that might not actually be there. So closing that down is really important. But for me to do that, I think it was a lot about thinking through that and understanding the sort of repercussions of not telling people the full story. And it's not that we weren't telling people the full story, but it was giving them even more knowledge. I think that's the piece that took some time to get used to.
I think that's such a valuable lesson that you're sharing there, that if you don't communicate everything to the team, then they just create stories in their minds to fill in the blank.
Yeah, definitely.
Tell me a bit more about the values. I think you mentioned ones like lead the change and explore the unknown. Tell me more about how you bring those to life in the business.
Yeah, so we've done all the usual things of printing the t-shirts and thinking about values fits for recruitment. But I think what's really important is we link those to our strategy. We have a 3-year strategy and we think about how those values can present themselves within that rather than them being two separate pieces. So a big part of, for instance, explore the unknown, how are we going to think about innovation over the next 3 years is linked to that. How are we going to think about making sure through AI enablement, we're going to help them lead the change in their, whether that be charity sector or public sector. So I think it's about linking those together so that it's throughout our business and we bring those things together rather than separating them and talking about them in away days, but then never again.
So, kind of everything you're doing, tie it back to those values.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
You mentioned before also that the Torchbox is an employee owned business. So, tell me a bit more about how that makes you different to perhaps an agency that isn't employee owned.
It's definitely fundamentally shaped how our business has operated. So, to give you a bit of background, when did we start this process? I think 2018 was when I started at Torchbox, and that's when Tom and Ollie, the original founders, started thinking about it. A year later, we started the process, and then we went through financial freedom 3 years later, so 2021. Employee ownership is about the business going from being founder led to being owned by a trust and fundamentally changed the way that we think about Torchbox. Everything's about the long term good for our co-owners. We build in a lot more accountability because we're answerable. I report to the trustees, which is a board of elected Torchbox employees. So that accountability is there. But I think the thing is that although employee ownership is really a big mindset shift, actually what we do isn't that different to any good business, particularly a service business. Nowadays, I think to run a really good service business, you have to be transparent, you have to have clear communication, you have to be really focused on your mission and values. And they're all things that the employee ownership system makes you think about. But actually, if I was to go back into a company that wasn't employee owned, I would still do all of those things. So it's no huge difference, but at the same time, it is. I think the second thing I'd say is a big benefit of employee ownership is about how we use our profits. So, touch wood, we are doing well and we have done for a long time. And it means that we can, A, return some of our money back to our employees and our people, and also we can invest money back in Torchbox. So, it's not going particularly to shareholders. So, what that means is, I think, for our clients, is that, again, in a service based business, our people are the most important asset we've got. So we are able to make sure that we remunerate them in the right way so we get the best talent and we can also invest. So we've invested about £1 million this year in innovation and our open source system Wagtail. And that is constantly making sure that our business is performing better and we're reinvesting that back into the sectors.
What's it like having to report into a board of trustees?
Yeah, so just to cover off how our board is made up. So we've got 4 existing employees. So there's elected. So we have elections at round robin every year. So one person steps down, then a new person comes up. So we've got 4 elected members of Torchbox. We've got 1 seat for our original founder, and then we have an independent advisor who's a lady called Jo Underell, who comes from the John Lewis Partnership. So we're in high esteem as they're the sort of big dogs in the employee ownership world. And I suppose that their specific role, because they're mainly employees, is around making sure that we run Torchbox in behalf of our employees for the long term. It's not necessarily so much around the governance side of things in a traditional trustee sense. It's about making sure that are we doing the best thing for our business and our people. So we've got our strategy, and they make sure that we deliver against that strategy. So it's really good for big picture things or decisions that will affect our people, and they act as a really good sounding board for us. I think the thing that is challenging or is difficult is that it can feel a bit clunky at first. So when we first started, we tried to embed them in our process of decision making. And that meant that actually, if coming from a founder-led business to suddenly having a trust that you need to report to about decisions, that takes a long time. And that felt a little bit clunky. But what we realized over time is we're not asking them to make decisions. We're asking them to ratify the SLT's decision. And that actually speeds things up and makes sure that they're not doing a job that they will find difficult to do.
When you moved to employee ownership and you took over from the 2 founders, what was that like?
Yeah, it was actually a really good journey. I think there's part of it was easier than I thought it would be, and part of it was more difficult. I think that obviously taking over from Tom and Ollie had been in the business for almost 20 years when I took over. It felt like a huge challenge to take over from these people that were so well known in the business. And I've been part of that sort of similar journey in other agencies. And what often happens is their mind is in that space to bring someone in to take over, but their heart isn't. So it means that you have a number of years of toing and froing between trying to take over the business and that actually not happening in real life. In Torchbox, that's not been the case. Tom and Ollie were always very gracious. Actually came across, those sort of few transitionary years actually were really easy for me, and they would really help that. I think what's easy to do though is try and replace the people. And actually, what you're really trying to do is replace the roles that they do. So I can't replace, and I never would be able to replace Tom as an individual or as Ollie as an individual. What I need to think about is what are the things that I'm good at, and then who do I need to have around me that can do the bits that I'm not so good at.
Yeah, so a like for like replacement with the founders just isn't going to happen.
Yeah, yeah.
So I guess for any founder listening to this who's perhaps thinking of handing over the reins and taking a step back, what advice would you give them?
I think the first thing is when you do that, make sure that you don't try and, have one foot in, one foot out. You have to make that break and start transitioning over. I think the second bit of advice is, as I say, not trying to replicate you. You're trying to find someone that can do the majority of your role, but actually with support, other people can help with that. It's a different environment going from founder led to a board or a CEO running the company for you.
And what about for someone who's potentially going to do what you've done, someone who's then taking over from the founder?
I suppose there's 2 big challenges. The first one is the saboteur on your shoulder, always sitting there waiting to tell you why you're not quite as good as what's happened before. So that's the first thing, to make sure you don't listen to them. And then the second part, I think, is around it's quite easy to double down on the things you're really good at. For me, that means the commercial side, the sales, running the business side. That's something that I can do. And I definitely spent a few years really focusing on that. I think what you also need to think about is what the bits that you're not so good at, how are you going to solve those? And if that's either bringing people in or do you need to get better at that? So things like that might be culture, it might be specific areas of the business that they've been heavily involved in. So I think it's easy to focus just on your core areas and not think about what will happen when they leave, type thing.
Yeah, that's great advice. And advice worth listening to, I think, because you took the business over when it was roughly 50 people and you've grown it to a 110 person business.
Or it still amazes me.
What changes have you had to make to your leadership style as the business has grown and more than doubled in size?
Yeah, I think the big thing is thinking about how you empower the people. So when I started and there was 50 people, you knew everyone's name. We went to the summer party, you'd know their partners' names as well. I pretty much knew at the time what piece of work everyone was doing. So you could make intuitive decisions on things like resourcing, how we move in different ways very quickly with you and a small team. When you're at 110, although we're still not 3,000, 110 is that sort of size where you go to the Christmas party and there's maybe a few people that have just started that you're not quite sure their names or whatever. So it's that sort of size, and you can no longer control everything about the business or through a small people. So you have to hand the reins over from a decision making point of view. And I think that people find making decisions in a way quite easy if they're not having to then commit and own that decision. I think that's the difference, is finding someone to tell you what to do is easy, but to commit and own it is a different thing. And that's the thing that takes a bit of time to do. So a good example is how we manage our resourcing at Torchbox. That was something that I was always quite involved in at the start. And at the beginning, we were in every day, we would be looking at how that was working. We would be making very quick decisions about moving people around. Once it got to 90 people, you just couldn't do that anymore. And everyone was working on different strands. We work across data, digital marketing, design, build. You can't keep that all in your head. And if you don't proactively hand that over, it just means that you're expecting someone to do something without all the knowledge. And actually, you need to, again, coming back to that piece earlier about frameworks, you need a process around that to actually hand that over and them understand what were you thinking in your head of making those decisions when you were 50 people, so they understand how to do it now that we're 110 or the area that they control.
Like you say, it's about getting those right processes in that work for the size you are. There's one process I want to ask you about actually. You mentioned before that you've recently invested £1 million in innovation. Many businesses struggle with innovation because you're constantly pulled into BAU and client delivery. How do you invest that money and make sure it's working and working well when you're still trying to deliver to clients every day?
Yeah, and we've definitely gone through some, we have some war wounds for doing it in different ways. So we've gone through the process of trying to do it within our BAU team. And the reason for that is because it's good to have people that are actually working on the ground doing it. But as you say, they don't have necessarily have enough time. We've all worked for agencies that are saying, we want you to innovate, but you've only got 10 minutes to innovate. And then you're back onto billable work. So that model definitely has its challenges. We've also tried to outsource it to a different team. And then it feels like they're a bit far away from all the work. So I think the sort of way that we're managing it now is a sort of three-pronged approach. So we have what we call our innovation lab, and our innovation lab is a team that have got time. They don't work on billable work. They only work on innovation work. And it means that they can look at foresights and what's coming up. They can have a play with different systems and take more of an experimental approach. But they're also very closely linked to our actual delivery teams. And that's how we deliver AI enablement. So workflow changes all come through those teams. So people can recommend ideas and work with that innovation lab to make that happen. And then we've also set up what we call the co-fund, which is co-funding client projects. So we'll part fund by 50% any sort of client projects that come up that are innovation focused. So a client puts in a brief, we tell them how they're going to do it, and we half fund that. And that means that we're getting ideas from the people on the ground. And I think when those sort of three areas converge, that's where we get our best ideas. So it's partly our innovation team, day-to-day delivery teams, and the client. And if we can bring that together, that's where the good stuff happens. For example, we've been working with a client, breast cancer now, and they came to us with an idea around a triage service for nurses that we, with our innovation lab, we put together a proposal. We built it very quickly, but it was in lockstep with our delivery teams, and that's actually spun that out and managed to get something to our client quickly. And I think at the moment, particularly in the charity space and public sector, although they really want to invest in AI, it's difficult for them to get funds. So we really want to support them in that and show the proof of concept and show how it works so they can then get further investment for delivery.
I think that's a really great idea for you to co-fund innovation with clients. Something we often complain about when working agency side is that clients just don't seem willing to push the boat out and to try new things. As the agency, if you're like, we'll pay half of it, It's a really great thing. And it must be motivating for your teams then to be able to work on these more innovative initiatives.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that they're all areas that are new to us as well. So I feel like it's fair to our clients that we are putting some of our money back in it because we are learning so much out of it as well. So there's a win-win on both sides. Our client wins, the agency wins. We hopefully also the end client wins because we come up with something which is better for them in the long run.
Win, win, win. Okay, let's stick on with process because there's a couple of other things that you've mentioned that I want to dive into today. So, one of the processes that you talked about was the scarf model. I think that's how you communicate with a team. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so I came across a chap called David Rocks, who's a neuroscientist who came up with this scarf model. And it's all about he talks about it's 5 domains that trigger your sort of threat or rewards response. So those 5 things are status, so how you're perceived or how you perceive your status within the world, certainty, so I think how certain is your future, autonomy, so how much of control you have over your what you're doing, relatedness, so can you understand what's happening in your world, and fairness, so how fair is this not just to you but to your community. So he's saying that these 5 things, if you communicate them wrongly, that sort of triggers your threat response, and if you communicate well, that communicates the reward response. And when I talk to our team in team meetings or we write our quarterly reports, it's important that I think about those pieces across in our communication. So a good example, 2 examples, I suppose. First example is a few years ago, we gave a 10% salary increase across the board. And at the time, we thought this is fantastic. It's part of employee ownership. Everyone's getting 10%. Everyone's going to be really happy. But I think in hindsight, although that's good from a fairness and a relatedness point of view, what it doesn't do is communicate to that status point of view because there'll have been people in the business who are thinking, I've worked really hard for the last year, much harder than XYZ. And although fairness is an important thing to them, they're thinking, why am I not getting a little bit more than someone who hasn't worked as hard? So I think that made me think about, okay, we really need to make sure that when we talk to things, it comes back to this sort of context point of view and making sure that we're communicating to people in the right way. So that's that sort of scarf model. And it really helps me. I don't get it right all the time, but it helps me think about making sure that I've covered off all those points when we think of our ideas, but also when we communicate them.
So internal comms are such an important part, especially as you're employee owned, and especially as, like you said, you're trying to be so transparent about everything. And you want to make sure you communicate it in a way that works for people and gets that reward response.
Correct. Yeah. And so we do quarterly meetups, we do quarterly reports, we're transparent about our finances. But as I say, with all of that information, it's quite a lot of information people take in and they're not necessarily used to it. So you really have to think about that context behind it. Otherwise, I think it can be more damaging than it can be good.
So, worst case scenario is you don't communicate at all, and the team just fill in the gaps in their heads with their made up stories, which I think you and also I have seen before and have been guilty of. The next step from that is to communicate, but works well. That triggers that threat response. But ideally, if we're following the SCARF model, we can get communications that lead to that reward response.
Correct. Yeah.
That's brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. Another process you talked about before, you mentioned very briefly, something called, was it the vital few that you said? Tell me more about that.
Yeah. Okay. So we used to use the EOS, which is the entrepreneurial operating system, which I think you might have talked about on a few of your podcasts before, as quite well known within the agency world. And actually, we used it for about 6 years and was really good for us. I suppose 2 things happened. First of all, we'd been using it for 6 years and we needed a bit of a refresh, and sometimes it's time just to change. And the second thing is that the EOS system uses rocks, and you have rocks that cascade from a company level and then down to your teams. And it can get quite rigid and complex once you get a bit larger and you've got more departments, and people start worrying about, oh, do I need to have a rock? If I haven't got a rock, is that a problem? So we wanted to really distill that down to the most focus. And we've been working with this agency called Form, who are a strategy consultant agency, and they introduced us to the Vital Few, which is about focusing on the really important things that you have to get done within the next year. So having the vital few pieces that would make sure that you deliver your strategy in the next year. And that is what we're focusing on now. So we have these vital few, which is at a company level, and then everything that we do at a department or at even an innovation level should be filling into that vital few. And it really has been, it's definitely something that the team has got behind. We're definitely still in our first year. I think what can happen is that vital few can become a little bit of a vital many. So we have to make sure we keep that as a small list, but it's definitely a different way of thinking about it and making sure that we focus on what is going to make Torchbox the better place to be in a year's time.
Tell me a bit more about the vital few and what process you go through to come up with these, make sure it's not the vital many, and also to make sure that everyone in the business is on board and buys into it.
Yeah. So the way that we've worked is that the individual SLTs have gone away and thought about, so charity sector, public sector have thought about what they feel are their priorities within the year. And then the board, so the overall SLT that sits across Torchbox, then has looked at those with that 3 year strategy in a away day and made sure that we focused on what are those really key ones that we need to do across the company to move us forward. And then every quarter in our quarterly reports, we report on how we're progressing with those and making sure that we're pushing forward. And then obviously iterating on them because, as with all these things, they change over time.
Yes, yes. And it's important that you're able to adapt over time because there's always new things going on.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where you've got to be careful that it doesn't become the vital many, that you then add something every quarter. If you add something, what do you take away? And that's the bit that I think we really want to try and focus on.
And I guess this is like doubly important to keep everyone aligned around this because obviously, if I think a few years ago you moved to being a fully remote business. So, talk to me a bit about the challenges of keeping that vision piece, the vital few on everyone's mind when you're not in the office together. I guess more than that, just collaboration and teamwork.
Yeah, so pre-pandemic, we had two offices, one in Bristol, one in Oxford. We were probably that just pre-pandemic, we were probably about 70 people. To be honest, we were already fairly remote because we had these two hubs, plus we had quite a lot of people working around the world. So it wasn't a huge shock for us when we went fully remote. We do still have our Bristol office, but definitely the majority of our team now are fully remote. I don't think we went through that process that a lot of companies have gone, is worrying about how productive our staff were. And I feel like, I hear a lot of companies talk about that. And I think that's a bit of a fallacy. I think that if people work well and work hard, they work hard at home as well as they do in the office. And people that don't work hard find ways to not work hard at the office or at home. So I think thinking that people aren't productive at home isn't actually the case. So that was good. But actually, I think that most of our people want connection and they want regular connection. And that's the bit that I think we need to be really careful of. And it doesn't necessarily always have to be with Torchbox people. I think it's human connection during work. So that can be going to events, it can be working out something like we work. It's human connection whilst they work. If they're sitting for 5 days at home on their own, that's when I think people's mental health affects. So the first thing is we try and get people to events. We have a program where if people want to work in WeWorks or similar, they can do, and we'll pay for that. So to make sure that, and then I think actually the amount that they have to connect with Torchbox once a quarter is surprisingly actually pretty good. And I think that we have our quarterly meetings that are face to face, and that is enough of a connection. If we have a really strong day, that is enough of a connection to keep them culturally aligned to Torchbox. And we really want to focus about investing in that day. And obviously, we have other socials and things, but investing in those days in the year that make them really good and impactful. And that's enough to keep us going across the. I think trying to push everyone back into the office, that sort of ship sailed for us now. And if people want to work at home, we fully support that.
It sounds like you're being very intentional about your being remote and how you maintain that culture and that togetherness and collaboration. Oh, brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for sharing so many wonderful things. I've learned so many things just listening to you. Let's look a bit to the future here. What's next for you and what's next for Torchbox?
Yeah, so I think this year we hit our 25th anniversary. So Torchbox has been around for 25 years, which is an incredible milestone, particularly in the digital world. If I think about when I started my career back in, I don't know, 2002, most of the agencies that were around then have either been subsumed into a bigger network or aren't around anymore. So for us to be proudly independent still, I think is a really good thing. And I think we've got a long future ahead of us. We're really at a good size at the moment where I think we have the clout and the clout from a client perspective, where we've got a great reputation within both the public sector and charities. And we're big enough that we can invest in different areas, but also we're small enough to be quite flexible. So it's not really for us about hugely growing. We want to stay around this size. And I think particularly with improvements in tech and advances in tech, it means that a lot of it will be about harnessing those powers rather than growing our headcount hugely over the next few years. But the big thing for us is about engaging with our clients and really showing that deep domain expertise and making sure that we can get better at the human part of what we do is really understanding charities in the public sector. And if we can keep driving that strategy, that is the most key part to all of what we do.
Brilliant. What a great way to end our conversation. James, thank you so much for joining, and thank you so much for sharing all of the wonderful things you do and have done at Torchbox.
Thanks, Trenton. It's been really good.
You've been listening to Human Powered, the podcast all about creating a high-performing agency or consultancy business. Thanks for tuning in.